Joining us now, NBC News senior policy reporter Shannon Pettypiece, NBC News White House correspondent Monica Alba, and former U.S. Trade Representative Michael Froman. He's now president of the Council of Foreign Relations. And Monica, we'll start with you. Has the White House addressed these new job numbers and those downward revisions?
They have, Ariel, and they're really trying to put this into a larger context. And it's notable that a couple of days ago, when that GDP report came out for the most recent quarter, they were really touting the economy. And it was even the president's own Commerce Secretary, Howard Lutnick, who was saying this is the Trump economy that has arrived. And they were really trying to point to some of those indicators as overall positive ones. But today, that jobs report, they are trying to put into a larger context. And again, they're trying to say that there are some other factors here at play. But overall, obviously, it wasn't as strong as some experts had expected. Here's a little bit more from the president's own chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors and what he had to say about some of that data.
The downward revisions to May and June are not great. A lot of that was due to quirks of a statistical process called seasonal adjustment, about 60% of it due to changing seasonal factors and things like incorrectly capturing teachers. But what that means is that most of those jobs will appear in other months of the year. Some of it is due to our border policies.
So remember here, overall, this is a president who is constantly touting his economic policies. They like to take a lot of credit when they feel there's good news, and they like to kind of back away from it and put some distance when there isn't. And this is an example of that. But also, there's the larger conversation that we're about to have about the president's own trade policies and his trade agenda, which also could be contributing to a little bit of this uncertainty. And that's a big part of the economic conversation here as well.
Shannon, I know you're looking deeply into this. Take us a bit more into the data, into the numbers, and how some of this correlates to Trump's policies, specifically maybe when it comes to immigration.
Yeah, well, economists I spoke to say that the only thing driving these numbers are the president's policies. That's the only big factor here that's weighing on companies. Certainly the tariff policies, as we've been talking about, the uncertainty created around those for companies about what's their cost going to be, what's consumer demand going to be like, how are they going to adjust to that. That has a lot of companies just pumping the brakes and putting things on hold. And you also mentioned the immigration policies. There's just a lot of uncertainty around that as well. There's certainly indications there's been shifts in the labor force and the foreign-born labor force. It's kind of difficult to tease that out in these numbers just yet. But if you're an employer and you are dependent on a foreign-born workforce, that is another factor of uncertainty that you're going to have in the back of your head while you're trying to make these hiring decisions.
And Michael, the economy is, of course, complex and it's interconnected as well. What do these job numbers say to you, and how do they relate to the overall economy, especially as we see the administration pushing forward with these tariff policies?
Well, I think we have to be careful about taking any one or two data points out of context. But in addition to the data points that you mentioned, we've also seen a modest decline in manufacturing employment and a more significant decline in manufacturing activity. So while there's been some positive news out there, like the GDP number, there's also been a lot of warning signs that it's not delivering what the president said it would deliver in terms of increasing manufacturing and manufacturing jobs in the United States.
Monica, after last night's executive order on tariffs, Trump spoke to NBC News. What did he tell us about the countries that haven't struck deals yet with him on tariffs, and what's the future of his policy?
Well, remember, the original promise was 90 deals in 90 days, and that ended today, August 1st. And even for some countries, the negotiation window is extended in effect, Ariel. And we know that there are certain countries that are happening and taking place on completely separate tracks, like China and Mexico, which are going to get these different windows of extensions. But even other countries, the president told my colleague Garrett Haake, are going to be allowed to return to the negotiating table if they want before some of these tariffs kick into gear a week from now. He said overall, though, he's very happy with how this is going, saying it went very well, it went very smooth. He's also saying, though, that if somebody wants to come along even a month from now, the president is saying we can make, quote, some kind of a deal. But remember, deal is a little bit subjective here because there are letters that the Trump administration sent to certain countries saying, here's the tariff rate you're going to get. Then there are tariff rates that essentially were given out yesterday with this executive order that the president signed. And then there's still the question of other ones that may shift in the coming days if a country decides to come back and have more discussions with the president. But overall, total number of deals are between between 8 and 10 of negotiated frameworks. We're talking about deals with the EU, with the UK, with countries like Japan, the Philippines, Indonesia, and beyond. But the rest are open questions. And one in particular is the negotiations that could or may not happen with Canada, of course, a really key trading partner as well. Ariel.
A lot of people keeping an eye on that. And I'm impressed that you're keeping your train of thought with all that noise going on in the background. Of course, a busy news day. So all the reporters standing next to you, Monica. Michael, this is what you used to do. You've been very critical of President Trump's tariffs. Tell us why.
Well, look, I think he has demonstrated that tariffs and access to the U.S. market is a potential source of leverage. I think what's very interesting is that the markets and countries have become quite comfortable with a minimal of 10%. And for most countries, it's going to be closer to 15 to 20%. Now, when President Trump came into office, it was about 2.5%. So this is a very significant increase, and it's going to have an impact on consumers, on manufacturers in the United States who rely on inputs from other countries for their manufacturing processes. And that's what we're going to have to really look at. The president has hoped that the tariffs are going to achieve revenue, which it's brought in about $100 billion, that it's going to create jobs and manufacturing in the U.S. There, we've not seen the results yet. And then it's going to have spillover effects into the broader relations with other countries who may be less willing to cooperate with us on other issues.
So what do you make of the president's argument that this is going to make America rich?
Well, look, from a pure revenue perspective, there's an inherent contradiction in his approach. If you're going to collect a lot of revenue, it means you're going to have a lot of imports, and you're not going to be moving production to the U.S. If you're successful in moving production to the U.S., it means you're going to have fewer imports and collect less revenue. So it's very hard to achieve both objectives. I think one of the challenges is globalization had the problem that the benefits were broadly felt, but were sort of invisible. Nobody walked out of a Walmart saying, thank goodness for the World Trade Organization. But the impact, the negative impact of globalization was felt very acutely by workers and communities in particular sectors and particular geographies. Trump has flipped the politics of this on its head. Now the costs of what he's doing, of tariffs, are going to be felt by everybody and be quite visible. And if he's right, and if there's manufacturing increase in the future, that's going to come 4, 6, 8 years from now and affect relatively few workers in relatively few industries. That's a very difficult political challenge to navigate.
Yeah, navigating political challenges and potential legal challenges as well. We spoke about the potential legal challenges to Trump's efforts on tariffs. The U.S. Trade Representative says those efforts are essentially irrelevant. Take a listen.
The reality is the countries understand the type of leverage that President Trump has created. That's why they're doing these deals, and they're going to stick regardless of what happens in litigation.
So help us make sense of this. Where's the reality?
Yeah, so what I've heard this idea suggested by some trade analysts and lawyers that, if they make a deal now, you allow imports of beef into your country and we won't impose a 50% tariff, for example. Well, if those tariffs have to go away because of a legal example, the other end of that deal, like you allowing U.S. rice or beef or agriculture imports into your country, there's a belief that that will still hold, that even without the threat of a huge 50% tariff or whatever, the other countries will uphold their part of the deal. It's unclear if that's actually going to happen, but at least at the moment, trading partners seem to be taking the threat of these tariffs remotely seriously and being willing to make some concessions. But it's certainly unclear what will happen if these end up getting thrown out. They'll ultimately will probably go to the Supreme Court and it'll be challenged there. And so it could be months or even a year before we have some resolution to that.
So say the Supreme Court decided these are unconstitutional. What happens to the tariffs at that point?
Yeah, well, I mean, under the law, legally, if they're unconstitutional, the U.S. would no longer be able to collect them. It's unclear if anybody would get back pay for their tariffs, though, at that point. But under the law, they wouldn't be able to collect them anymore.
Michael, Trump on Truth Social once again is calling for Powell to lower rates today, but he's not bringing up the jobs numbers that we saw today, even though that would potentially mean that the softening of the labor market could make it easier for Fed Chair Jerome Powell to have a reason to lower rates. Do you think things will change from here?
Well, the Fed is in a difficult position because it's got that dual mandate of controlling inflation, prices, and promoting full employment. And the data is pointing in opposite directions. Inflation ticked up a bit in June, and the question is, will these tariffs lead to further inflation going forward, that would restrain the Fed from cutting rates. And on the other side, as you said, the job numbers show a softening, and that might lead the Fed to cut rates instead. And so the Fed is going to have to weigh these two things and decide where to put their priority. If I can just make a comment on your point about the legal issues. The president may or may not win on the legal issues, but the Congress has given the president a lot of delegated authority when it comes to tariffs. And it may not be as quick and as easy as using the emergency powers as he's used, and which is being challenged, but he has other authorities that may take more time. Ultimately, I think the countries are taking these tariff threats seriously, because one way or the other, there's going to be increased tariffs, and they just have to get used to that.
And we may see those as soon as next week. Shannon Pettypiece, Monica Alba, and Michael Froman, thank you all.